Hi everyone, my name's Emily from Art K, and today we're going to be painting a watercolour whale. I love whales so much because of all the textures they have on their body. And today we're going to be painting with a really limited colour palette, basically focusing on green and blue, and creating different tones with some additional colours to help us along the way. We're going to be looking at glazing, dripping, and how to create these really soft textures. So I'm really keen to see what you create, whether you follow the same colour scheme or do something different. So there's links in the description of how to share that with us. And for now, let's go get painting. Today we are painting a watercolour whale, and for this we need only a few limited supplies. So we've got a piece of paper. You can use a normal piece of paper. If it's watercolour paper, it will be better. We need some paintbrushes, so I've got a wash brush, I've got quite a large brush, a really small one and a medium one. So it's really important to have the smaller ones, and we can get away with not having the big wash brush. We also need a pencil and a rubber, and a watercolour palette and some water, which isn't quite in shot. There we go. So we're going to start by drawing the whale. So the image of the whale that we're going to work with today can also be downloaded, so if you prefer not to draw along with me, or you prefer an additional reference image, then please download that and you can use it at the same time. So my whale is actually going to go off the page a little bit, so I'm going to start with its mouth over here. So let's start a little bit further up. So I'm about this point here, so possibly just above a third of a page, and I'm just going to do a nice long, this is a rough guidance. So this is its mouth, and its back curves a little bit, and then it goes up for its tail. So this is where it's going to go off the page, because I want to focus a lot more detail on the body. So here I'm going to, so this is the front of its mouth. I can always change it as I go along. I'm just trying to get a rough outline down. And then I can always use a rubber. And I'm pressing quite lightly with my pencil. If I don't press lightly, then it may come through when we start painting the watercolours, and really we don't want that. So what I'm going to probably do is actually take off some of it once I've got the definite outline. I'll take a little bit of it up with a rubber, so I don't see it when I paint. So I'm just going to bring that in a little bit and then rub that out. And curve that round. Make the adjustments where you want. You may want it to be a fatter whale because it gives you more space to draw and paint. I'm now going to add in the fins. So this one is swimming at an angle, so it's coming towards us, and it has one fin going off in this direction and one fin going down, so they're kind of like that, the two fins. This one is going to be a lot bigger, so I'm going to start at this point here, and I'm going to come out, and it's going to look a little bit weird to begin with, so we come out quite horizontally, actually going up a little bit, just past the body, and then we're going to come down, and then you can round that off because it's not quite a point. And then from here I'm going to come out, and this is going to be more of a curve. I'm going to come down like this, and this is again going to go off the page because of the perspective of the piece. So again, you can make little adjustments. I'm going to rub out the body line that's underneath because I don't want to see that, and I also feel like it's going a bit narrow, so I'm just going to adjust that a little bit. so it doesn't come in as far. So little adjustments, otherwise it might look like it might fall off. And my other fin is going to come down here. So this is the middle of my whale. I'm starting maybe an inch to my left. So again, this is going to bend out. And actually my angle here isn't quite right. I need to come out a little bit angled to the left. And this fin is a lot further away, so it is going to be a lot smaller. And then it's going to come something like that. Again, it's going to look a little bit weird at the moment because obviously we haven't got any of the depth with the tones that are going to change the way that it looks in terms of our perspective. The final bit is I need to put in the line that separates for its mouth, and this for me is going to go across, so I'm going to be parallel to the top line, and then here I would say at this point here, so wherever that ends up on your whale, for me it's about 1/3 of the way across. I'm then going to start to bend down. So I've got a curve, I go bend back up over my fin, and then I'm going to curve back down. I'm just going to put a little line for its eye. I can play around with that later, how I'm actually going to depict the eye. And that's it, that is the sketch. So I really don't want to put in any more details. The rest of it I'm going to show with my watercolours. I want to keep it really light so that I don't see my pencil mark through the watercolours. So I'm going to leave it like that. I'm going to start with the body of the whale, and for this piece I'm going to keep my colour palette quite limited. I'm going to focus mainly on greens and blues, and I want this to be quite mystical. So I'm going to start with the areas that I want to be the most intense, greens and blues, and then I'm going to work to create a wash and create a little bit of pattern on the rest of it. So we'll be using a few techniques in this, and we're going to play basically as we go along, so you don't have to use the same colour palette. But I'd restrict your colour palette to a few colours. And like I said earlier, I'm just going to take off some of the darkness so that I can still see the lines, but they're not going to come through. So they're getting really pale and you may not be able to see them anymore. But I would recommend doing the same thing for yours. Definitely taking away any excess lines that you may have drawn when you were sketching. Most of us do. I'm just taking off so it's just a ghost image basically. Perfect. I'm going to take the slightly bigger brush and I'm going to start by putting my water in my brush in the water, and I'm going to go for a darker green colour to begin with. I'm going to start working in by the tail at the top, and I'm going to start with this colour. So now I've got that nice and wet, before I go any further, I'm going to actually give a bit of a wet wash onto the tail. So make sure that you don't have any rubber left behind, because that will be a little bit frustrating, and also don't go over the line that you want to put the glaze on, because otherwise you'll start getting all the green in the background. And now take your colour and just put it on and see what happens. So it's going to spread because we've obviously put glaze down. I'm going to move to my lighter colour. I'm just going to dab it on. So I'm moving my paintbrush really quickly. So I want to see how those two colours interact with each other. So I'm moving downwards, I'm kind of making this quick motion. And it's producing a really nice hue. So I'm going to then kind of pull with just my water, I'm going to pull that. So I'm just taking my wet brush and I'm pulling it across to see where does that go. And I'm moving along the line that I drew in my painting because I want to see how the colour travels. And I'm going to go to my yellow. I'm going to put some dots of my yellow because there's some highlights over here. This is where the sun is going to catch the surface of the whale. So obviously this isn't a realistic whale. We're using it as an opportunity to experiment with some watercolour abstract-y painting. So I'm leaving a bit of a gap here because I actually like the way that the colour has worked its way around some white patches and I don't want to disturb that. But what you can see is I've kind of done I'm doing some swipes. So I'm creating gestures in this direction. And now I'm going to go to my blue. And I'm going to stick to my light blue. I didn't mention at the beginning, but the palette is from IKEA and you can find that in the materials list. So when I have a lot of pigment on my paintbrush and I just gently touch the surface where the water is, you can see it starting to play with the water, which is really cool. It's kind of creating a marbling effect. So I really enjoy this and it's a really good way. You can wash your brush and create some more lines. So I'm putting the lines in the direction of how the body flows. So I wouldn't do lines up this way. I'm only going to do lines in the direction of the body of the whale. So I'm just going to do a few more. And it looks a little bit blue, but that's just because the water's blue. And I'm going to go back to my blue and I'm going to touch it into the areas that I've just swiped the water across in. And do you see how it just moves and it creates its own pattern? I don't want to be determining the pattern myself because I want to see what the watercolour does. I don't want it to be an even spread. But I also recognise that there's quite a lack of connection between this section and this section here. So what I would like to do is try and bring those two together a little bit more. For me, I feel like I need to make the blue kind of go up the inside of the tail. If I do that, then it feels like the blue is coming out of the green. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little bit of water on here. I'm just going to dab it so that I don't disturb the green. Because I don't want to disturb the green, I just want to add on top. If you're feeling a little bit uncertain about that, you can let it dry. And I'm just going to add really lightly and making sure I'm not putting too much concentration onto the surface. We can see it starting to mill around this area here, so I'm just going to drag it up. I actually want a little bit more blue because it didn't end up as poignant as I wanted it. I feel like that's a little bit more connected. And I might come back to it later and add a bit more depth to the blue, but for now I want it to dry. So I'm going to leave that. I'm going to work more in this area because I do want to work with this light blue and turn it a little bit darker. So I'm going to do a light wash, and I'm going to cover the whole area. So you can see that that connected that water patch with this blue, and it created a really cool pattern. So again, it's quite unexpected what you get. And if you don't like what you've done, then you can very easily just dab it up with a piece of tissue paper. Again, we're seeing those sections running into each other, which I really enjoy. I'm just going to actually drop in some of the blue. So I'm going to get a lot of blue on my brush, dip it into the water, and I'm going to drop that in because humpbacks have quite speckled bodies, and I want to give the impression that he's got little speckles all over him. So you can see the kind of pattern that it creates is really interesting. I'm just going to keep doing that. I don't want them to connect all together, so I would put them far enough apart that they're not all going to start mixing together. And I'm just going to create that moving up the side here. And it's wonderful because you can see there's a pool of water that's dragging this across, and I would never have been able to predict that. But it also distorts what's going on up there, which I really like. So have a play. Maybe you want to do a completely different colour on top. You might want to do some greens or some greys, and just see how it develops, because they're not going to stay exactly like that. They are going to constantly merge. But to me they almost look like sea anemones kind of branching out. So I am actually going to use some black. I don't want much, I want it to be really light. So I'm going to get it really watery. And you can see that it's basically coming up grey. Because this section is one of my darkest sections, so I need it to be really murky. So we've kind of gone light. We've gone light, and we're going dark, and then we're going to end with some light. So I'm going to go back to my bright green at the end, and just got a few bits of dust, and I'm going to paint quite strong colour of green. I want to bring my dark blue now into the green. so that they don't feel like different sections. I am going to work a little bit more into each of these sections, but I need them to dry first. So I'm going to leave them as they are for now, and then I'm going to come back to them, and once they've settled down a bit, I'll then be able to add a bit more detail. I'm now going to move on to this lovely fin, and actually I'm going to just take up a little bit more of the pencil marks. Ooh. And I want this section to be really, really green and yellow, and I want the colour to play with itself. So I'm going to give a very light wash. I want to be surprised, basically. So I don't want loads of water, just enough to encourage movement. And then I'm going to come to my lighter green first. I'm going to work light to dark. So I want quite a lot of pigment on my brush. Then I'm lightly touching it so that it spreads itself. So not the same as this up here. This is a very harsh edge. Here I'm encouraging, I'm wanting to find out what it's going to do. I'm going to come from this side. A bit more water for that. And some colours might just be better at spreading than others. You might need to encourage with a bit more water. I'm going to go back to my green, my darker green. So I'm going to make them meet, and then I'm going to take my plain brush and add a bit of water to encourage them to move in different patterns and see what they come up with. So in that white section in the middle, I want it to be like a greeny blue. So this is already edging towards greeny blue, but I want it to be a little bit bluer. So I'm going to paint this on here. I'll wash my brush, and then I'm going to go to my blue and paint on top. And then again use my paintbrush to encourage movement. So if you feel like you've used a little bit too much water, like me, you can then get your paper towel to dab it up. So I've got my paper towel, and I'm just going to dab lightly. See if I can soak up the water, but also let it still run into strange shapes. Or maybe you want to create some of the texture with your paper towel. To give a contrast. So I think that looks quite fun. I'm going to take a slightly smaller brush, and I'm going to go to my dark blue. And up here I'm going to add a little line to frame the edge, and some wispy gestures. You can also, if you have a paintbrush one, you could try and scratch it out with that. So the bottom of my paintbrush just dragging the colour into different directions. And I'm going to frame it a little bit on this side as well. Oh, paintbrush disintegrating. And I want that to disappear into the dark green colour. And for me, that's going to come up there. And then I'm going to make it bleed with some water. And then dab a little bit up, so that it's paler. Kind of re-go into it with some light brush strokes. I'm looking at this section here and I want this to feel like a different colour tone to the top. So I've got a lot of bright colours up here and here. I can actually see a pool of watercolour, so I'm actually going to just take that off. But I don't want that texture up there that I did at the bottom. I'm just going to kind of go over that with some light brush strokes like that. So I'm going to do a bit of a wash here to start with, and I'm going to do it with some darker, a really light dark green, if that makes sense, and a bit of black. So I'm going to wash that down here and curve up around there. For washes, I tend to use a bigger brush because it gets a smoother effect. So I'm just going to paint some water along here. I'm going to leave a little bit of white at the bottom so I don't paint it all the way down. And I'm taking a little bit of my green and then quickly taking a bit of my black. And I actually want to see some of my brush strokes here. That's the effect that I want. I want to see this kind of layered effect. So I'm just accentuating my brush strokes. I'm going to leave a little white gap to show where the mouth is. You can see how this is, you can see some bits of black, some bits of green, and together it gives an overall nice impression of merging colours. I'm going to come a little bit further down, so to here, I'm leaving about 1/2 inch of white at the bottom. I'm going to try a bit of this ochre. It might end up quite a monocolour, but if I don't enjoy it, then I can just take it up. So it just adds a little bit, still kind of working with that greeny, browny colour palette that I have going down here. But it adds a bit of difference. So I'm going to take my water and I'm just going to take a tiny bit of green with the light green. So you can barely see it, but I just want to fill in that white gap at the bottom with that light green. At the moment, the top is definitely dominating over the bottom, and that is the kind of idea that I wanted. So I want to focus on details, and I'm going to put more details in as we go around once it's dried a bit more. So for the underside of the whale, they tend to have lots of algae and moss. Is it moss? Just dripping down. So I want to add that in, and I'm going to start that by taking my medium brush, and I'm going to go to the dark blue. I'm going to paint alongside the edge. I'd recommend turning your page around, but just for simplicity, I won't. So if you do some light dots, just like we did on this part of the body, and then you can drag it down with the bottom of your brush. So just a downwards motion. And it doesn't have to be in the same direction all the time. Some can be longer than others. And this is just the first layer, so I'm going to keep adding some dots. And then I'm using the bottom of my brush to add on the direction. And I'm going to stop about here. So here they're going to be a lot more subtle, and they're going to be a lot darker, so I'm going to add on some black. So taking my black, I am going to add some less often, but I'm going to add some black dots. So I've got 3 there, and then I'm going to get more and more concentrated. So I'm going to drag those down just like the blue. And they're probably going to mix together. And you can see that it's starting to create a nice texture. So some bits might be a little bit spiky, so you can just go back with your brush and alter that a little bit. I think I want to smooth out the top so that I don't have the spikes coming in, or if I do have them coming in, I want them to be blended like this. I want them to be kind of wet and giving a bit more thickness to it. So if you want to make them, you can just add some water. And get them to blend together a little bit. Moving on to this bin down here. I've got some wayward blue marks. It always happens. So I'm going to start with some blue, and then my lighter blue, and I'm going to start by just painting that on. I need way more water than I've got there. So I'm going to paint that down the edge. And then I'm going to add on some water. And then add a bit more blue. So I'm adding my water, add a bit of blue, add my water. And I like how this is kind of creating a shadow. So I've got this outline here and then it's shadowing over. I'm going to do the same from the left, but I'm going to go with my green. So I actually want this to be slightly wonky because I feel, again, we're probably going to have some growths that we would see on this side. So I'm starting with the outline of where I want it to go. I then add a little bit of water. So I'm just kind of patting it so my paintbrush is moving like this. And then I add green. And then I can go down the middle. Again, kind of patting. I might add a little bit of the darker one as we get further down. What you'll start to see is as it dries, we get this kind of resonant? Wrong word. We get a remaining powder as the watercolour dries. Your watercolour might not do exactly the same thing, but I quite like this effect. It really feels like it seals in the edges and also kind of merges in the middle. So I'm kind of having a think, you know, where do I want to add more detail? I want to add some more detail, especially up here, to show the barnacles and the other things that kind of grow on the surface of the whale. And I also want to give a sense of this connecting to this section over here. I quite like this feeling of like movement. So I'm going to take some darker blue and try and move that with some long brush strokes into this section over here. I also need to consider that I've got a pencil line here. So either I'm going to cover up that when I go and do the background wash, or I need to kind of conquer that a little bit now. So I am also going to add in some, I'm actually going to consider adding in some more texture along this bottom section. Ooh, for detail, I'm going to use my smaller brush. And I'm going to start with the dark blue. I'm going to I need this to be quite concentrated because this is detail on top rather than a normal wash. So I'm going to start inside one of these sections so it can feel like the dark blue is emerging from the light blue. And I'm going to kind of, instead of shaking, it's gonna kind of dot in there, and it's gonna weave its way through the gaps. So dotting here and then going through the gap. So kind of dotting around here. So it gives it a little bit of texture there. And then weaving in to the dark blue. So I want to give it a little bit more texture and I want the tone to be deeper. So I'm going to put more pigment, well, more paint, but pigment on my brush. And I'm going to give, these are long brush strokes with smaller ones underneath. So I need this pattern to move in to this section as well, otherwise it will look a bit odd that it's just stopped. So this is the second layer on top of this section over here. And now I have to consider, do I want to move that into a dark green and do the same thing over here, like a light green going into a dark green? And I think I do, because at the moment I've kind of got a bit of a gap here where there doesn't look like there's much going on. And I also actually want to increase the intensity of this section here. So I'm first going to do that. So I'm going to get some dark blue. This time I need a bit more water because it's not for detail, it's actually for layering. And I'm just going to add in a layer. I'm going to avoid the patterns because I don't want to ruin that. And I'm going to use a bit more water so that you can't see the brush marks. Just working it back in. So it's almost like these little bits of, these little lines are kind of, they're going towards this section where they join the dark blue. It's almost creating a web. And then I need to get this merging into the other one, so I'll use my water without any paint to facilitate that. And that's a lot more exciting because I've got a bit more contrast. So instead of it all being really light, I've now got contrast. And I like the idea of this forming a web. So I'm going to continue that idea with the green over here. So I'm going back to my small brush. I'm going to start with my light green. So I'm going to do some small lines. My light green has to go into my dark green, so I want to be really careful with how I show that. So my light green is going to join up with this light green up here, so it's almost going to disappear up there. So I use my water and it disappears. And then I'm going to take my dark green and that's going to join the line. So that was my light green line. I've now blended it into the dark green and I'm going to bring up with small, very, very small lines to give even more texture up here. I'm going to do that a little bit more. So starting with my light green. Going into my dark green. So you shouldn't even be able to tell where it goes into the dark green. And using it to go into small lines to disappear into this darker section up here. So I'm keeping it lighter in the whiter patch and then I'm taking it darker and small lines up into this dark blue. And for me that really is drawing these two sections together, so I feel like there's a sense of continuity. I'm just going to add on a little bit more dark green at the top so it feels, again, kind of increasing that sense of we're heading for a specific area. So I'm really happy with what's going on here, and I want to have a little bit more excitement at the bottom. I'm going to continue this idea of small lines emerging from one space and taking it to the other to give that sense of connection. I'm going to start with some dark blue. So because I've used the dark blue here, I want to bring it up a little bit so that it feels connected to the body. So I'm going to take my dark blue And I'm going to do some long lines. So just long wispy lines. Perhaps the algae has grown. So he looks a little bit hairy. Probably isn't very accurate for a whale, but this is a mythical whale. So I do want them to be quite strong. And I am just doing some long lines. I'm not really worrying too much about the exact shape, so you don't have to mirror my exact shape at all. I'm just giving some general curves. And these curves are kind of disappearing into this section down here, which I really like. So when they disappear into that section, I'm going to move them into a green. So I'm going to pick up, going on top of some of the blue, so we blend, and then move it into the green. And this is the dark green. And that's going to come over here. I'm also going to blend this line of dark blue into dark green and taper that off. I'm getting very excited. I hope you are too. So a lot of this is just it's very happenstance. It will be, you can play with it. Some of it might not go very right, so you can dab it up, and some of it you might be really happy with the mistake that you created, and that's always really exciting. So do take risks and see what happens. And always, if you want to add more depth and more layers, then glaze on top like I did here. So I think, for example, up here I'd like to be a lot more intense. So I'm going to go to my slightly bigger brush, and I'm going to go back to my light green, and I'm going to do some light green on top. I've got lots of water. You know, you could even practice dripping. So if you started at the top with lots of water, you could then hold up your piece, like I'll show you now. So if I put loads of water on my brush with lots of pigment at the same time, I can then untape it if you've got it taped and see how it runs. So you just hold it upright, and you're creating like almost like a marble run. So you can turn it to try and determine where it will go. So I've got one run coming down here, which I don't really want, so I can just put that up, and I don't actually want it here either, so I'll just wipe that away. But I do want this one that's coming down here, which is really interesting. So I'm just going to keep holding it. And I want it to kind of come in this way to go along the lines that all of the rest of the ones that I've created. So if I hold it this way, then I actually might get some dribbles down this way as well. If you don't want to wait, or you want more colour, you can just add. So you can add some pigment, and then you could add some water. The more water it has, obviously, the further it will dribble, and eventually it should go. And if you decide that actually that's where you wanted to go to, like it joined up with this section here, I think that's really fun. So I'm going to stop there and tape it back down. So if we're going back to this section up here, I'm going to go to my dark blue, and I'm going to do a little very, very small, just gentle bumps. To give it some texture. if, like me, it's got a lot of powder and actually the powder is resisting putting these bumps on, just add more and more pigment by reducing the amount of water you use until it takes. There we go. And I think mine are going to get a little bit smaller and closer together at the front. And then they're going to get bigger as they go backwards. Oh, and you can see what not to do down there, but that'll get covered up later. I'm also going to put some coming down his chin. And bring some across the jaw. I then actually like to add some white marks. So this might be interesting because I really should probably wait until it all dries. Let's see what happens. So I needed to clean my white a bit, it was a bit pink. So if I swirl and get a lot of pigment on my brush, a lot of paint, a lot of pigment, so it's really coated, and then see, so if I'm going to put some white, yeah, no, that's not going to work too well. It's not strong enough as predicted. So I'm actually going to take some white acrylic. So I'm just going to get some white acrylic. So if you want to join me in getting some white acrylic. So I'm just going to add some blue dots around the mouth. And I've decided I'd actually like to add some white. And the white watercolour isn't really going to stand out enough. So I've got some white acrylic, so if you also have white acrylic, that's great, and if not, then don't worry and perhaps just take another colour for now. So I've got some white acrylic, and I'm going to do some dots around the mouth at the front. And then I'm going to do some dots here. So they're not obvious, these dots. I don't want them to be obvious. I want them to be quite lumpy. So I've got quite a lot of paint on my brush. I'm just leaving a lump there because it's more for texture. And they're going to get smaller as I go down this way, and they're going to disappear. And I'd actually like to add in some lines of acrylic. So just staying with the white. Just some sweeping lines. It's just going to look quite ghost-like. And I'm also going to paint along, you don't have to do this if you don't have white acrylic, don't worry, but I'm going to paint along the white gap I've left with white acrylic. Perfect. So I'm really happy with my whale. I don't want to make any changes, but of course, if you want to make changes, please do. You might want to experiment with more texture, with more layers. For me, I'm going to now focus on the background, and because my whale is so light, so I've got a lot of light colours, I'm obviously going to avoid using the same colours. So for example, I wouldn't have green here because I've got a lot of green down this side. So I'm going to have a really dark section over here, and then I'm going to move a little bit lighter so I'm going to have a blacky blue, I'm going to move to a dark blue, there's going to be a light blue here with a bit of green over here, and then going to the dark blue. So I'm going to take off the masking tape on the corners That way I can paint the whole thing, and I don't really need to held down a tool anymore. If it peels off some of the paper, I wouldn't worry. People won't really be focusing on the corners, and if you frame it, then obviously no one will see it. So I'm going to start in the really dark corner over here with my blacky blue. I'm going to take my wash brush with my dark blue, and I'm going to start over here. Please be careful when you get near your whale that you don't paint the background colour on it. So I need more paint. Don't worry if it goes on your table, it will come off its watercolour, but the sooner you wash it off, obviously, the better. So I'm adding some black. I go back to my blue. And I want this to be really smooth because I've got a lot of texture in my whale, that I want a really big contrast, which is why I'm doing a lot of dark. So you can see I'm kind of starting where I need to not go over, so the edge of the fin I start and then I brush backwards. It might not be as easy when I get to the body and at corners, like up here I can't really do that. So you'll have to move to a smaller brush. You might also need to do 2 layers because this isn't coming out that dark and you really want to contrast. Being really careful along the edges. I'm going to switch my brush to get around the edges. Still trying to stay in that horizontal direction to try and avoid seeing the brush marks. Just going to turn it around a bit. I'm actually going to use a bit of this light green do along the edge here. And moving to my slightly lighter blue, which I'm going to mix back into my dark blue. And we're gonna come to my, I'm gonna come back to my green and kind of go near, trying to be light. So if you use a lot of water, then you can gently brush over the algae that you've done up here, so that it shows that the water is behind it, but we don't ruin all that detail that you've done. And then I'm going to use a little bit more green, just like I did over here, to kind of highlight the presence of the whale. But I want to make sure that I go back to my blue. So my blue and my green don't get confused over here. So don't worry about like having it 100% smooth, just do it the best that you can. Obviously water does have light on it, so it's not realistic to be completely smooth. We're just aiming to work with the impression that we're trying to create. So obviously this is kind of a well, it's not a mythical whale entirely, but it's not the normal colours, so it doesn't have to be completely accurate either. So I'm working back towards the dark over here, but I'm going to go, my lightest point is going to be up here. So I'm going to work mainly with my light blue, and I might give a little bit of green around. So this blue is really pigmented, so you don't actually have to use as much. And I'm going to add a little bit of the green in. Maybe a little bit of the darker green. Not a lot, just enough to give a bit of a hue. So again, I recommend going to a smaller brush. I'm just, especially around this edge. Make sure it's not too dark, so you can always add some more water. So now it's there, I can pull it up, pull the water up. So I'm going to go for my darker green over here, because we're working back to the dark patches. And adding a little bit of the black as I go towards the darkest section. And I move to this part. Top right. And this part is going to have a lot of black. I'm adding some black first, and then I'm going to go to my dark blue. I want a lot of my dark blue on my brush, just like that. line. So I'm going up to the line and I'm going away from it so that I don't go over the line. So I'm going to come back round and I'm going to try and add a little bit more colour on top because it's quite pale still and I don't want it to be as pale as it is. So I'm not using much water because there's still quite a lot on the surface. And so I'm only going to need water when I get to a section like this where I want to kind of blend it into another colour. So dabbing off my brush, then wetting it only with the paint to try and get it a little bit darker. And I'm going to work my way back round. So going to the lighter blue, again not using much water. So you see that it's taking a lot more colour, which is great. So we get that real contrast. So I almost feel like this starts to make the whale look like it's like it's an angel whale, which is a bit weird, but it's kind of glowing in the middle of the ocean, which is fun. So lightly tapping around the detail like we did last time so that we can blend in the green. And moving around again to add more blue to the top. So I'm kind of adding in a bit more of my black, which I did last time. Turning it around. So I really need to make this section dark. I need to get more pigment on there. So I'm going to wash my brush, but then I'm going to dab it to try and get quite a lot up of the blue so that my blue and my black work together. So really swirling with my paintbrush to get the blue colour. Which is creating a really nice dark tone now. So yeah, so some tricks. So if you want to obviously get it darker, then use less water. You can always dry your brush a bit on paper towel and then swirl it a lot around the palette. Try and pick up as much pigment as you can. Sometimes it's really difficult. Sometimes I find these bigger wash brushes are more resistant to picking up the colour and transferring it onto the page. I think I find it a lot easier with the smaller one. So if you're finding it really difficult, then try switching your brush to a smaller one and see if you can get more with that. So I feel like I got a bit of a discrepancy between this dark section. So I'm going to bring a bit more dark colour over here. And then I'm going to work it a little bit more here so there's a bit more of a transition. And then I think I'm probably nearly done. So I'm just adding a bit of black so the colour matches. And then a bit of dark blue. Trying to make it as smooth as possible, so like I said earlier, if you don't want it smooth, that's completely fine. You could even create texture with some tissue paper. I'm just trying to take away some of the brush strokes. And then I think I need to kind of come out of the dark blue here so that it's clear that the sections are combined. So that gives a lot more consistency across. I think I need to touch up this edge here with my smaller paintbrush to give a bit more definition. So I just need to bring a bit more black across the top, and I'm just going to turn around my page and take out that. So I need a bit more black. I need to just bring and I'll turn that around. See what it looks like. Lovely. So I'm really happy with this as a final piece. Again, if you would like to add more layers, add some texture, use some tissue paper, maybe a sponge in the sea. You could also sprinkle some salt on there and leave it and see what patterns that creates. For now, I really like how this has turned into kind of angelic being in the middle of the ocean, and then we kind of got the dark, misty depths below. I'm really keen to see what you've created, so please do share with us your photos. And yeah, if you've done any different colour schemes, that's also really great to see. And hopefully you come back for some more watercolour or another medium. Thanks!